Democratic societies have an outstanding opportunity of evolving with the help of a new decision principle called Systemisches Konsensprinzip. That means, translated, Systemic Consensus Principle. This process has already begun in mediation, conflict management, in organizations and businesses. As strong believers in democracy, we are used to carrying out the will of the majority. We take it for granted that a majority must be fought for in order to win decision-making power. The principles of democratic decision-making are grounded in praiseworthy traditions. This makes it sound almost utopian to say that there could be an even more intelligent form of decision-making than the principle of majority rules. If we take a look at ourselves today and see what has become of the idealistic principles of democracy, we have to admit that conditions have arisen in the system that have had a negative impact on the development of society. A society has evolved that wastes precious energy and time fighting for power. With this decision-making scheme, people who want to have their interests acted on have no other choice but to fight against their opponents. Along with the ever-increasing loss of values, the lust for money and power, ruthlessness and corruption spread ever further, while democracy falls in a downward spiral on the verge of collapse with this inappropriate decision-making principle. Let's try to get to the very root of the problem, the actual reason that causes democratic societies to suffer. Can we escape the hold that traditional power has on this society? If we as a people want to coexist peacefully with others, we'll need to not only look for the interests of a select few, but of as many as possible. We will therefore try to come to as close as possible to the consensus. The fending off selfish or even ruthless powers can only be brought about by using a more intelligent decision-making process. A simple example will show how we can make better decisions without having to fight for victory or defeat. Let's begin with a simple deadlock situation. Let's for example take 4 mountain climbers. Max wants to climb the Schroffkofel. Hannes wants to climb through the Eisrinne. Klaus wants to cross the waterfalls to the Klammkopf, and Walter wants to climb the Hochkante. All 4 want to go together on a climb, but each wants the others to go with him. They know that they won't be able to decide using a democratic vote, since each one would vote for his own tour. What should they do? What can you do in situations where the democratic majority principle fails? Deadlock situations can have long-lasting adverse effects in real-world politics, or they can even make forming a government impossible. However, working towards a consensus makes sense in more than just extreme situations. The Systemische Konsensprinzip can do just that. As already mentioned, it means Systemic Consensus Principle. The process is called Systemisches Konsensieren or Konsensieren for short. In our simple example, 4 suggestions have already been made. Each of the 4 friends wants to convince the others to go on his preferred tour. None of them knows how opposed the others are to the tours of the friends. It would make most sense for the group to choose a tour that has the least amount of opposition. This assumes that it is possible to accurately measure the intensity of the objections. We solve this problem by using values to stand for the level of opposition. The value 0 means I have no objections for this tour, and 10 means I'm totally opposed to this tour. The values between can be set according to one's personal feeling. This is acceptable because the conflict as well is caused by emotional sensitivity. With help of what is referred to as Null-Lösung or null suggestion, it is possible to measure how important it is to the four friends to go on a tour together. The null suggestion is if the mountain climbers are unable to come to an agreement and decide to split up. Everyone takes a piece of paper and writes down the suggested tours, including the null suggestion, and rates all these propositions. They are done quickly and then enter their values in a small table. Max suggested the Schroffkurve, so the opposition value is 0. He doesn't like the Eisrinne, but he considers the Hochkante to be a pretty good climbing tour. To him, it's unlikely that the group will split up, unless Hannes' Eisrinne tour is voted for, in which case the split would be inevitable. Hannes really wants to climb the Eisrinne. He attempts to come out on top by setting the values against the other suggestions quite high. However, the Hochkante is the tour that he would most be willing to accept. If one other of the group would be willing to go with him, he wouldn't be opposed to splitting up. Klaus wants to go to the Klammkopf. He's really good friends with all the others and doesn't want to get on anyone's bad side. He therefore rates all the other tours with the same low opposition value. If his tour isn't chosen, his voting scheme leaves the final decision up to the others as to which tour to go on. He wants the group to stay together, so he rates splitting up with the highest resistance. Walter suggested the Hochkante tour. He has already been on the Klammkopf many times. He is also not a big fan of the Eisrinne. If this tour is chosen, he wouldn't be opposed to the group splitting up. Now the opposition values for each tour can be added up. As we see, the Hochkante tour had the least amount of objection by all mountain climbers. Therefore, this is the suggestion that comes closest to a consensus. The Null-Lösung had the worst value, which means that the group wants to stay together. The result even manages to convince Hannes. He realizes that if they all want to go together, that it makes sense to choose the tour that they all have the least objection to. Experience has shown that this argumentation is convincing to children, teenagers, adults, and the elderly alike. Walter is happy that his suggestion was accepted. But this is not a triumph of a victor that fought and won against the others. With Konsensieren, it isn't possible to vote for your own suggestion. At the most, you can rate it with 0. Your success is due to the votes of the others. Walter is therefore thankful that his friends are going with him on his tour. The opposition values also give us insight into the participants' minds, which is harder to achieve through normal discussions. In cases of deep conflict of interest, it may be necessary not to reveal this rating information. The example shows an additional noteworthy advantage for the decision-making process. It can't be blocked. Not even when the democratic majority rule principle fails. Let's take a look in a situation in which the democratic majority rule principle does not fail. What would happen if Fanny came along? Fanny is Klaus' girlfriend, and she would go on the Klammkopf tour for his sake. Due to Fanny's decision, the Klammkopf tour would have the most votes. If Fanny was aware of the power of her vote, she would realize that according to the traditional majority rules principle, she could select any of the tours and the others would have to go with her. It's not Fanny that has to go with Klaus. On the contrary, Klaus has to go on the tour that Fanny chooses. The traditional majority rules principle reveals after all a large weakness. In this case, it gives a single person the power to decide for the whole group. This phenomenon is known as the power to tip the scales. It leads to a critical corruption of the balance of power. In cases where the balance of power can only be achieved with the help of a splinter group, the majority rule principle is reduced to the point of absurdity, because then the majority is dependent upon the splinter group's decision. Coalitions break down all too often due to this boomerang effect. Let's ask Fanny how she rates the tours and the Null-Lösung. We see that she has lots of respect for the Eisrinne. She knows that the Hochkante is a pleasant climb with a beautiful view, but she would rather side with Klaus. Splitting up would not be a problem at all for her. In fact, she would rather go on a tour alone with Klaus. Now we can determine the opposition values of all 5 people. The Hochkante remains the tour that has the least amount of opposition. Following the traditional majority rules, Fanny would have had the power to decide on her relative majority. This principle would have sent the group on a tour that was heavily opposed. However, our mountain climbers are now much wiser in the meantime. They go on the Hochkante tour because it's the one they all objected to the least. The null suggestion is not an option for them, as was clearly shown in the ratings. We can thus generalize. With Konsensieren, the group comes the closest to a consensus that takes all participants into consideration. Thereby, the group is protected against the egoistical interests of a relative majority. With Konsensieren, the decision-making power is not left to a minority group, but instead stays within the entire group. It's not the fight for power, but rather good solutions that win the day. For this, you need neither a coalition nor a splinter group to swing the balance of power in order to come to an absolute majority. This saves time and energy, even in politics. These principles and explanations are available at SK-Prinzip.eu. You can also download the free ebook Wie wir klüger entscheiden from there, which includes many practical examples.